You probably picture the ancient world as a slow, practical place, small bands of people moving with the seasons, making tools from flint and bones, eking out a living where they could. You imagine long, patient steps toward agriculture, toward towns and kings, a gradual climb from scattered huts to cities. Now imagine instead, on a windswept limestone plateau above the plains of Upper Mesopotamia, strangers arriving at a hill and lifting stones that weigh more than a small car, carving animals and symbols into them, setting them upright arranging them with a deliberate, ritual geometry unlike anything their era seemed to have earned. That clash between what we expected and what the earth quietly preserves is the true opening to the story of Göbekli Tepe. It is one of those rare sites that upends neat timelines, on the one hand a place of weathered, domesticated stones pointing to ceremony and memory, on the other, the stubborn evidence that such monumental thought existed before settled farming, before pottery, before the chronologies that scaffold our textbooks. UNESCO describes monumental, circular enclosures cut into a limestone hill, with T-shaped pillars rising up to carry carved animals and abstract symbols, structures attributed to groups of hunter-gatherers in the pre-pottery Neolithic and dated to the 10th to 9th millennia BC. If you lean in with me, you'll feel the contradiction as a hum beneath the voice of the landscape. Who decides to place meaning in the shape of stone before there is a village to maintain its memory? Who organizes work parties to quarry, to polish, to carve, for what seems like no obvious economic return? This script is an invitation to look, to imagine, to be unsettled. We will walk the plateau at dawn and peer into the shadowed bas-reliefs. We'll trace the long debates that archaeology has held in whispers and in fierce conference halls. We'll listen to competing voices, the measured voices of radiocarbon labs, the speculative ones of mythmakers, the careful hypotheses of field archaeologists, and the thrilling, sometimes reckless leaps of writers who want a story that answers too neatly. I promise you revelations, precise measurements, radiocarbon ranges, an inventory of animals carved into pillars, the names of the archaeologists who brought the site back into the public eye, and with each revelation will come questions that do not yield to simple answers. That tension is the point. Keep that edge of doubt close as we move forward. Archaeology is a conversation across time, and Göbekli Tepe is a loud, stubborn participant. Let's anchor ourselves first in the cold, concrete facts that we can most confidently rely upon, the things that archaeologists keep coming back to and that have shaped every theory since the site's modern rediscovery. Göbekli Tepe sits on a natural limestone plateau roughly 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Sanliurfa in southeastern Turkey, part of the broader Upper Mesopotamian landscape that we often call the Fertile Crescent. The site's monumental architecture, circular and oval enclosures dotting the top of this tell, features T-shaped pillars, some of which, scholars note, reach heights of up to 5.5 meters and bear complex animal and abstract motifs. These pillars are carved in relief and sometimes in high relief. In some cases the shafts are anthropomorphic, with arms and ornaments suggested in stone. The first archaeological work that recognized the extraordinary nature of these megaliths in modern times was accelerated by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in the 1990s, though the hill was noted in the 1960s. Over the years, radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic analysis have placed the active use and construction of many of Göbekli Tepe's monuments in the pre-pottery Neolithic horizon, a window that broadly spans around the 10th to 9th millennia BC, ages that cast those pillars among the oldest monumental stone architectures in the world. There are a handful of core mysteries here that recur in every serious discussion about the site. First, the social question. How did largely mobile hunter-gatherer groups marshal the labor, skill, and resource coordination necessary to move multi-ton blocks, to fashion them into symbolic forms, and to dedicate time, and therefore opportunity cost, to monuments that do not appear to be domestic? Second, the sequence question. If monumental religious architecture predated, or at least coincided with, the domestication of plants and animals, might religion, or the social gatherings religion fostered, have helped drive the shift toward settled life, rather than the other way round? Third, the symbolic question. What do the carved animals, hybrid forms, and repeated abstract signs actually mean? Are they clan totems, mythic narratives, astronomical markers, memory devices, or something we cannot yet glimpse from the tangle of time? Fourth, the ritual question. What occurred inside those circles, feasts, rites of passage, funerary practices, sacrifice, skull display, and how do we read stonework as an index of social behavior? The answers proposed over the past 3 decades range from careful, evidence-driven hypotheses to bold reconstructions that read the site as a center for worldwide lost wisdom. Our task in the next sections is to take each of these mysteries and let them breathe, to unpack the evidence, and to confront the exhilarating unknown. Picture the plateau at sunrise, fog clinging to terraces, flint tools catching a pale light, and the trunks of those T-pillars rising like the ribcages of enormous, sleeping figures. Imagine stepping into a circle where 2 central pillars face each other, the space between them a deliberate hollow, and where benches run against the inner wall. You can almost hear the echo of voices or the clatter of pottery that never was, the ghosts of feasts where people who still hunted and gathered took time to be together, crossing social boundaries and setting agreements into stone. Let that image sit beside the lab reports and the conservative conference papers and you will begin to see why Göbekli Tepe has caught the modern imagination. It insists we re-see the past not as a linear march of progress but as a room full of choices, some of them daring and surprising. Now, with that stage set, and with those anchors in place, let us move into the mystery segments. Each segment that follows will be a deep dive into one key conundrum, blending archaeological detail, scholarly theory, and a pinch of mythic narration, the mixture that best fits a cinematic documentary voice. I will name the scene, describe the finds and measurements, run through competing explanations, sprinkle in the more sensational possibilities that populate popular imagination, and then close with a reflective invitation to place yourself there, standing under the cut sky at dawn, feeling the sediments of all those long human choices beneath your feet. We still don't have neat answers, but we have wonder. And where there is wonder there is the promise of new hearing and new seeing. The first mystery is the one that makes people stop and reread their textbooks, the builders themselves. Göbekli Tepe's builders are often called hunter-gatherers, a designation that tells us something critical and something incomplete. The label is critical because, by most counts, the economy visible in the material record lacks the telltale signatures of full agricultural dependence. Domesticated cereals are not abundant, and the kinds of storage facilities and household remains linked to settled, agrarian villages are not dominant in the earliest occupational layers. Yet the scale of investment, quarried pillars, deliberate layouts, carved iconography, is the kind of communal labor that seems to require coordination at a social scale we usually reserve for settled groups. We know these things from stratigraphy, tool assemblages, and radiocarbon measurements that consistently place the monumental phase early in the pre-pottery Neolithic. So how could mobile or semi-settled bands accomplish monumental construction? One set of theories argues for episodic aggregation, seasonal or cyclical gatherings where groups that otherwise lived in dispersed bands converged at the plateau to perform rituals, carve, and work, pooling labor and resources briefly but intensely. Imagine annual festivals when the plateau filled with people who normally lived spread out across the landscape. Such events could gather dozens, even hundreds, for weeks at a time, generating a labor force sufficient to move and raise pillars. Another proposal reframes the labor question within the broader social economies of the period. Long-distance exchange networks may have already been robust. Raw materials and foodstuffs could have flowed between groups, enabling a ritual elite to command labor without a settled demographic base. Some archaeologists suggest a middle ground, semi-sedentism. Groups that were seasonally sedentary near rich resources but still exploited wild landscapes, could produce communities stable enough for ambitious architecture but still not agricultural in the classic sense. Now, here's where it gets tricky. All of these interpretations require us to picture social structures without clear, preserved analogues. We have to infer institutions such as leadership, ritual specialists, and labor organization from the stones and the spatial logic of the site. We must resist the temptation to project our own, modern political categories onto these ancient people. For instance, the idea of a single, king, or centralized state is not supported by the evidence. There is no palatial architecture, no clear administrative tablet, no dense domestic quarter that would suggest a bureaucracy. Yet leadership of a communal, ceremonial kind charismatic elders who could call groups to the plateau for ritual labor, is plausible and fits ethnographic parallels in which religious authority summons and organizes seasonal work. Still, for all the evidence, we do not have consensus on whether Göbekli Tepe's construction was driven from the top down by a small cadre of organizers, from the bottom up by many small groups cooperating, or by emergent institutions that looked nothing like our categories. We still don't know who exactly decided that a day's labor would go into lifting stone rather than into hunting, or how many lives were changed when the pillars went up and a shared memory was cemented into rock. Into the scholarly vacuum come the more sensational ideas, the ones that make headlines and drive viewers to the plateau in droves. You have likely heard the grand theories: ancient voyagers with lost knowledge, secret cults venerating giants, cosmic alignments that mark forgotten calendars. Some of this is pure speculation, some rests on small echoes in the archaeological record, carved human heads, skull fragments, and careful placements that could be read as displays. There are hints that human remains, including skulls, were treated ritually in the broader region in roughly the same eras, and that suggests practices of ancestor veneration or trophy display. But the leap from ritual manipulation of skulls to a global skull cult is vast and not borne by conclusive evidence at Göbekli Tepe itself. Similarly, claims about astronomical alignment, that pillars point to solstices or specific celestial events, are tempting and not impossible. Some researchers find patterns, others find the data too noisy or the interpretive framework too subjective. The proper place for these ideas is not in dismissive scoffing but in careful testing. Can patterns be shown repeatedly, statistically, and with controls? At present, some celestial hypotheses remain intriguing but contested. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, brushing dew from wild grasses, eyes fixed on the carved silhouettes of foxes and vultures that peer from the stone. One can feel the strain of human hands that once hewed the limestone, the smell of smoke and animal fat long gone but somehow imagined, the clasp of community as a practical necessity and a spiritual balm. Standing there, we are compelled to fold our present curiosity back into the ancient moment. What made these people gather here, year after year, to recall or reaffirm something that was clearly of vast importance? The reflective answer hints at the universal. People make monuments to bind memory, to signal identity, to hold time still for what matters. Göbekli Tepe, if nothing else, tells us that this impulse, to take the slow permanence of stone and give it the quickness of human meaning, is older and stranger than we once believed. We still don't know the full contours of those social arrangements, but we do know that the human need to gather and to mark existence was powerful enough to change landscapes. Before we leave this first mystery, let us be fair to the conservative end of the spectrum. Some scholars caution against overeating the early levels, emphasizing the fragmentary nature of the excavated record and the need for restraint when reconstructing social systems from ceremonial architecture alone. It's possible that what we find at Göbekli Tepe is only a narrow window into a larger, more mundane world that included many forms of economic life now invisible to us. In other words, monumental religion might coexist with simple farms even if traces of those farms are thin or dispersed. Still, for all the evidence and all the restraint, Göbekli Tepe insists on the startling fact that in a world we thought small and slow, people built big and with intention. You step closer to the carved face of a pillar, and the stone seems to speak in a language that has no agreed dictionary. The animals, foxes with arched backs, vultures with outspread wings, snakes coiling in bas-relief, wild boar, gazelle-like forms and strange, heavily stylized humanoid figures, are everywhere, repeating, mirrored again, as if the carvers were copying from a repertoire of signs rather than inventing anew. The first thing to understand is that these motifs are not decorative afterthoughts. They are deliberate, repeated, often paired in ways that suggest grammar. Pillar 43 leans like an elder toward its counterpart in the same enclosure. Its shoulders, rendered as flaring slabs, bear not only animal forms but also abstract symbols, deep, shallow, circular, linear, that return in different contexts. The scale of these images matters. Many are life-sized or larger, meant to be seen at human scale and to be touched by many hands. Whatever language the stone uses, it speaks to human bodies gathered beneath it. Archaeologists catalog these images as iconography, a set of motifs that, taken together, might encode myth, memory, social identity, clan emblems, or mnemonic devices for oral stories. But iconography is never neutral. It is always a choice that signals what a people found worth recording, worth repeating. When we try to read this stone speech, we rely on analogies, ethnographic parallels, regional comparisons, and pattern analysis. And when those analogies fail, we confront the limits of our comprehension. Precisely dated layers and meticulous recording have given us a rough chronology for the motifs. Radiocarbon samples from charcoal and organic residue in contexts associated with the monumental levels of the hill place active construction and primary use roughly between the 10th and 9th millennia BC, an era scholars call the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A and Early Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. That is to say, these images were carved and curated by peoples living nearly 12,000 years ago, close to the dramatic transition where human groups in Southwest Asia were experimenting with plant management and the tentative beginnings of animal domestication. The sheer antiquity forces us to ask what kind of symbolic life preceded visible agriculture. Iconographies often arise in settled contexts where surplus supports artisanship, but here we see refined symbolic work already in place. This is one of the reasons that some researchers speak of Göbekli Tepe as an architectural manifesto, a deliberate public statement about identity and memory at a moment of social transformation. If we imagine a sequence, repeated gatherings, shared stories, ritual practices, then the repeated motifs become the lexicon of that social conversation. The question is not only what the symbols mean but how they were used to bind people together. Were they clan emblems, rites of passage, or visual anchors for oral epics told during long winter nights? Each possibility opens a different window into human life in the 10th millennium BC. Now, let us be fair. Reading iconography is slippery. The temptation is to assign a neat narrative. A pillar shows a vulture, therefore they worshipped vultures, therefore they believed in sky spirits. But such direct mappings are inherently speculative. Symbols are polysemic. A vulture can be both a scavenger and a psychopomp in different cosmologies. To advance responsibly, archaeologists combine context and comparison. They note that vultures appear alongside human figures and frequently near depictions of headless bodies or skulls in the broader Neolithic landscape, which suggests a practice of skull curation and ancestor display seen at some contemporaneous sites. This dovetails with osteological evidence from the region, selective treatment of crania in mortuary contexts, modifications that indicate ritualized post-mortem handling rather than purely utilitarian disposal. Another repeated theme is predation. Animals of prey and predator paired or juxtaposed, which some read as mythic narrative, a dramatized conflict between forces of the natural world, perhaps encoded into origin stories. Yet others see solar or seasonal cycles hidden in the repeated sequence of animals, with migratory birds marking seasonal change and serpents indicating earthbound transformation. These are competing lenses: mythic reading, ecological reading, funerary interpretation, and each one is supported by fragments of evidence, none of which, alone, wins the prize of certainty. But here's where it gets tricky. Recent finds from surrounding Taş Tepeler, Stonehill, sites complicate any single, neat interpretation. Similar motifs appear at Karahantepe and other nearby enclosures, suggesting a shared symbolic vocabulary across a landscape rather than a unique idiom limited to one hill. That points to regional networks of communication and cultural exchange. If motifs recur over tens of kilometers, they likely functioned as recognizable signs across groups, something like a shared mythic grammar or ritual code. If we accept that, then the iconography at Göbekli Tepe functioned not merely within a local congregation but as a node in a wider conversation across early Neolithic communities. That, in turn, reframes our social questions, not just how a single community carved meaning into stone, but how meaning was standardized, transmitted, and recognized across a mobile population. It suggests that social cohesion in the 10th millennium BC was partly achieved through shared visual languages, the earliest forms of symbolic networks that could transcend kinship and geography. Still, for all the patterning, direct translation eludes us. We can't line up ancient symbols with modern words and expect one-to-one correspondence. The presence of repeated abstract signs, chevrons, rosettes, deeply cut lines, indicates a level of abstraction that might correspond to non-iconic concepts, seasons, ritual acts, categories of beings. Some scholars argue for a numerically oriented reading. Repeated marks might function as counters or tallies linked to ritual calculations. Others see calendrical notation, possibly mapping lunar or solar cycles. Counterarguments point out that without corroborating material, textual notation, or independent calendar markers, these numeric readings remain speculative. A cautious consensus asks for more evidence before endorsing any single interpretive framework, while also acknowledging that the visual patterns at Göbekli Tepe display a sophistication that hints at oral traditions with formalized structures, the kind that could support proto-myths or mnemonic epics. Enter the more sensational possibilities. Myth-laden writers and speculative historians have long taken the richness of the iconography as evidence for global contact, radical technological leaps, or esoteric priesthoods guarding lost wisdom. Some propose that the similarity of certain motifs to those found in distant parts of the world, often claimed in pop archaeology, indicates transcontinental exchange or memory of a lost, advanced civilization. Others read anthropomorphic pillars with carved belts and arms as evidence of deified ancestors, giants, or even beings of another origin. Such theories have the virtue of narrative clarity and the vice of overreach. They stitch disparate data into a coherent story, but at the cost of ignoring regional specificity and the archaeological rigor of context. The responsible way to handle these sensational ideas is not to dismiss them reflexively but to test them. Do motifs truly show direct parallels beyond what convergent evolution of symbols would predict? Are the similarities precise and contextual, or are they high-level resemblances that different cultures could independently produce? To date, mainstream archaeology finds little compelling evidence for transcontinental descriptive equivalence at this early period. Convergent symbolic motifs are a more parsimonious explanation than lost civilizations crossing oceans in the 10th millennium BC. Picture yourself in the shelter of the stone circle as the sun tilts low. The carvings catch the lengthening light, shadows travel across the flanks of snakes and the faces of birds, and for a moment the stone seems to animate. Imagine a storyteller shaping those motifs into a narrative, a tale of hunters and seasons, of ancestors who walk among the living, of beasts that double as moral metaphors. The human impulse behind the iconography is unavoidable: to name, to remember, to teach. Whether those carvings are mnemonic devices for the survival knowledge of migratory routes, shorthand for clan identities, or incised myth scenography for ritual drama, they embody a people's attempt to grip immaterial memory with stone. Our reflection here must be humble. Symbols that survived inadvertently shape our questions. They prohibit arrogance and demand patience. We may never translate the stone perfectly, but we can learn to listen, to hear pattern, repetition, and emphasis, and in that listening, we find connection to a humanity that used image as the scaffold of social life. Next, consider the blazing, communal feast, a practice as ancient as fire itself and central to theories about how monumental projects were possible before widespread agriculture. The idea that feasting powered monument building at Göbekli Tepe has become a powerful interpretive tool among archaeologists, not because it explains everything, but because it offers a plausible mechanism linking ritual practice, food economies, and labor mobilization. Feasts do several things at once. They require surplus and coordination, they create social obligations and reciprocal debts, and they produce occasions for display, performance, and the reaffirmation of alliances. The plateau stones, the benches, the open central spaces, the fire-reddened sediments found in some enclosures, suggest places where large groups could have gathered for prolonged ceremonial meals. Organic residue analysis, hearth structures, and faunal remains show a diet that includes wild ungulates and bird species consistent with large-scale hunting, while botanical remains, though less abundant, hint at early plant management nearby. These pieces together weave a picture of ritual feasting as a glue, a social technology that can pull together dispersed populations into intense, cooperative episodes of stonework. Measurements and deposits bolstered the feasting hypothesis. Midden layers containing animal bones in high concentrations, burned residues that indicate cooking fires capable of supporting groups rather than small households, and the spatial organization of enclosures with benches facing inward all point toward collective consumption. In ethnographic analogues, large feasts are often used by non-state societies to cement alliances, redistribute resources after hunting surges, and negotiate marriage ties, all activities that would encourage groups to cooperate on projects requiring episodic labor. The labor needed to move multi-ton pillars could be reciprocated with ceremonial food, alcohol. Prehistoric fermented beverages are not impossible, and ritual prestige, a calculus of social return rather than economic surplus alone. In short, feasting could be the mechanism that converts temporary gatherings into sustained construction projects. You gather, you eat, you sing, and you lift stones together. Now, let's be fair. There are counterpoints. The faunal assemblages sometimes show patterns consistent with specialized hunting rather than just surplus-driven feasts. Some bones suggest selective butchery and secondary processing that might have served other domestic functions. Moreover, long-term provisioning of large groups requires logistical systems and storage that the site's earliest layers do not conclusively demonstrate. Critics argue that while feasting could explain episodes of aggregation, it does not fully solve the challenge of sustained, organized labor over years or decades. It also risks imposing modern, festival-centered models onto the past without sufficient evidence for seasonality or ritual calendars. Yet, for all the caution, the feasting model remains attractive because it links the two stubborn facts we observe: the presence of monumental labor and the absence of clear agricultural surplus in the earliest phases. Feasting offers a middle path, a social economy built on episodic abundance, prestige redistribution, and ritual reciprocity. Into the feasting narrative drifts the alluring mythology of sacrifice and spectacle. Some sensational accounts imagine mass ritual slaughter involving slaughterhouses and organized sacrificial systems. Others claim that human sacrifice was systematized and served to mark transformative social events. The physical evidence for systematic human sacrifice at Göbekli Tepe is tenuous. Human remains are relatively scarce in the monumental contexts, and when they appear, their treatment often fits secondary burial or skull curation patterns rather than wholesale ritual slaughter. We do find cut marks on bones and evidence of butchery on animal remains, but to extrapolate these to a culture of institutionalized human sacrifice would be a stretch. A more cautious, and perhaps more honest, mythic reading would admit that while spectacular rituals likely occurred, they need not have been lethal. Performance, display, and symbolic offering would also produce intensity without requiring systematic killing. The human mind, hungry for drama, often fills the archaeological quiet with blood and fireworks. Sober interpretation asks for hard data before conferring theatrical explanations. Picture yourself now in the thick of a feast, smoke blurring the edges of the circle, voices rising and falling like tide, men and women bringing roasted meat and large hides to be traded, the rhythm of drums or sticks keeping time for a communal chant. Imagine that the lifting of a stone is accompanied by a feast, with obligations and debts being recorded not in clay but in memory and song. The reflective insight is that the social works of memory, feasts, stories, physical markers, can accomplish what economic surplus alone cannot. They persuade people to act together, to imagine long-term projects, to bind identity across distances. Göbekli Tepe may well be evidence of a ritual economy in which food and memory were currency. That does not close the argument. It only opens a bolder question: who decides when a feast should be held and who gets invited? We still don't know the social calculus by which people chose to invest in stone rather than, say, a more immediate domestic need. We still don't know the social calculus by which people chose to invest in stone rather than, say, a more immediate domestic need. From the edges of the feasting reconstruction, another question grows like a shadow across the plateau. Göbekli Tepe did not stand alone. It is part of a constellation, a landscape of stone hills, the Taş Tepeler, that scatter like punctuation marks across the upper reaches of the Fertile Crescent. To understand one circle is to begin to imagine an entire grammar of space and memory, and when we widen our view, the plateau becomes not a singular miracle but a node in a network. That realization changes the tone of speculation. A single monumental hill could be the result of local ambition. A network implies communicative intent, shared ritual calendars, and the possibility of a regional identity forming before the town and the temple became tidy, separate categories in our histories. Walk with me now not just across a single enclosure, but across country lanes between stone hills. Picture early communities moving between seasonal camps, exchanging flint and obsidian, sharing stories at waterholes, and recognizing the stones that stood on certain plateaus as common markers in a dispersed social map. Some of the nearby sites contain T-shaped pillars and carved reliefs that echo Göbekli Tepe's motifs, though each place has its local accent. These repetitions suggest that motifs and monumentality traveled, whether by itinerant carvers, by traveling ritual specialists, or by the simple diffusion of ideas through marriages, gift exchanges, and shared rites. The implications are profound. If symbolic forms circulated across a broad landscape, then the cognitive step toward abstracted, repeatable sign systems existed before the domesticated village stabilized, and our neat sequence, of settled life first, complex symbolism later, begins to blur. But here's where it gets tricky. Evidence from dispersed sites gives us pattern, yes, but it also raises new logistical questions. How were such networks maintained over generational time without the administrative tools of later states? One possibility is that ritual calendars provided the scaffolding, seasonal gatherings that people expected and planned for, like the predictable migration of animals or the ripening of particular wild plants. In that scenario, people remained mobile but kept an itinerary of shared places and times. Another idea emphasizes material networks. Long-distance exchange in the Neolithic has strong support in the archaeological record through the movement of obsidian, shell, and specific stone types. Trade networks are not the same as ritual networks, but they overlap. An exchange of goods becomes an opportunity for the exchange of ideas. A third possibility imagines itinerant specialists, stoneworkers, ritual leaders, storytellers, who traveled and carried the lexicon of symbols with them, leaving signatures in local stone as they went. Any one of these mechanisms, or a combination of them, could explain the recognizable motifs in distant places. The story complicates further when we consider the topography and visibility of these stone hills. A monument on a plateau is not just a place of gathering, it is a landmark, visible across miles on a clear day. That visibility transforms a monument into a signpost, a territorial marker, and perhaps a stake in a larger map of social memory. Travelers coming from different directions might find in the stones a shared language. This is where our group meets. Or, this is where we remember the story of the flood. Or, this is where we honor the ancestors. The monument becomes an anchor for time as much as for space. If you stand on a neighboring hill and can see a pillar glinting on the horizon, you perceive social cohesion at a distance. You can orient yourself by stone as reliably as you might by a constellation. That was a powerful tool in a world without maps and without permanent administrative posts. Still, for all the elegance of networked rituality, we must confront a stubborn problem. Much of what we infer depends on absence as much as presence. Many of these sites have been partially excavated, disturbed by millennia of weathering, and in some cases, impacted by modern development. The archaeological record is a palimpsest with gaps, and scholars rightly worry that our narratives could be shaped by the survival of certain kinds of remains at the expense of others. A grand, landscape-scale ritual economy sounds convincing when you see motifs repeated across the region, but proving recurrent, coordinated gatherings requires subtle evidence of seasonality, storage, or repeated return, evidence that is often fragmentary. Thus, with humility, researchers compare patterns across multiple sites, test for synchronous use through radiocarbon dating, and search for material signatures of repeated occupation. The more we test, the more our picture evolves. Some places appear to have been used intermittently, some continuously, and some only sporadically. The mosaic is messy, and that messiness is part of the truth. Imagine yourself on a ridge between two stone hills at twilight, the plateau behind you dotted with flickering torchlight. A messenger arrives on horseback in a later epoch, imagining the plateau as ruins, but in the 10th millennium BC that same place thrummed with human intent. You can see the logic. To be seen is to be known. To be known is to be spoken about. To be spoken about is to be remembered. The reflective insight here is simple and uncomfortable. Human groups of deep antiquity had both the imagination to carve meaning and the practical sense to communicate that meaning across distance. Monumentality, then, is not accidental. It is a deliberate technology of memory and presence that presaged later forms of territoriality and identity. The next thorny riddle is the one that makes method-minded scholars grind their teeth and makes sensationalists reframe the story into heroic leaps: dating and stratigraphy. How do we know when the stones were carved, reburied, or refurbished? How confident are we in the ranges offered by radiocarbon dating, and what exactly do the dates refer to? The carving? The final use? The last fires? The work of dating a site like Göbekli Tepe is meticulous and methodologically layered. Radiocarbon dates come from charred material associated with construction or use phases, hearths, burnt seeds, human and animal bone, and then get calibrated against known fluctuations in atmospheric carbon to produce calendar ranges. Stratigraphy helps. Earlier layers beneath a monument provide terminus post quem, a point after which a layer was deposited, while the fill that buries pillars can tell a story of abandonment and intentional sealing. Together, these techniques create a temporal scaffolding. Yet every measurement has uncertainty, and calibration curves can shift as laboratories refine their models. That uncertainty is not a bug, it's a feature, an honest accounting of the limits of our precision. Now, let's be fair. Radiocarbon dating has illuminated Göbekli Tepe's antiquity in ways that no other method could, producing ranges that consistently place the monumental phases well into the 10th and 9th millennia BC. Those dates transformed prior assumptions and remain among the most robust elements of the site's chronology. But disagreement still simmers on details. For example, debate exists over whether some of the carved pillars predate the main construction layers or whether certain architectural features were later insertions. There is also the matter of the burial of the stones, the seemingly deliberate backfilling of some enclosures with debris and sediment. Why would a group painstakingly build monumental circles only to bury them intentionally? One set of interpretation sees the burial as ritual closure. Sites were decommissioned with ceremony, their lives wound down intentionally so that future generations would remember them as sealed. Another, more pragmatic set of interpretations suggests that backfilling could protect sacred stonework from weathering or changing social conditions. Some have even suggested defensive reasons or the desire to reshape landscape memory. The truth could be all of these, varying across time and context. But here's where it gets tricky. Controversies around dating and sealing sometimes get weaponized in public debate. Critics of mainstream archaeology will emphasize uncertainties and argue for radically different chronologies. Proponents stress consistency across multiple samples and labs. The responsible listener should do two things: appreciate the genuine depth of methodological rigor, and accept the honest limits of dating. Science progresses by refining error bars, not by pretending they are not there. For our narrative, the important takeaway is that we can be confident that major work at Göbekli Tepe occurred very early in the Neolithic sequence, and that the chronology complicates simple causal stories about the origins of agriculture and ritual. Imagine yourself watching technicians in a modern lab, gently powdering a piece of charcoal, extracting a sliver of ancient carbon, and then speaking about half-lives and calibration curves. The drama of stone meets the quiet precision of isotope analysis. Both are acts of translation, converting the material record into human-readable time. Our reflection then is about humility. We have tools to measure, but each tool only gives a slice of a much larger temporal cake. We interpret slices and try to assemble a whole, knowing the edges will always be soft. That softness is where imagination and science must coexist. Another intimate, unsettling mystery is the treatment of human remains and the ritual life that might have surrounded death. Across the broader Near Eastern Neolithic, we find evidence of secondary burial practices, plastered skulls, and careful curation of crania, gestures that suggest an active engagement with ancestors and with the bodies of the dead. At Göbekli Tepe the picture is complex. Human bones occur but are not as prominent in the monumental context as they are in some contemporaneous sites. When they do appear, their treatment suggests selective handling, removal of skulls, careful placement in particular contexts, and sometimes modifications that imply ritual attention rather than mere disposal. These signs open a window onto a worldview in which the boundary between life and death was porous, where skulls could serve as mnemonic anchors for lineage and memory, and where the dead participated in the social life of the living through curated remains. Yet, as always, caution is required. The absence of abundant burials within the enclosures could indicate that those sites were not designed for interment. They might have been places of assembly and performance rather than repositories of dead bodies. The presence of curated skulls at other regional sites suggests a spectrum of mortuary behavior rather than a single, unified practice. Another interpretive strand points to competitive display, keeping the skulls of outsiders as trophies, though clear evidence for widespread trophy-taking in this region and era is limited and contested. The safest reading is one of diversity. Mortuary practices were varied and deeply symbolic, often tailored to local needs and cosmologies. Picture standing in a small, shadowed chamber where a skull sits on a ledge, eyes long gone but its position deliberate. You feel the human urge to name, and to remember pressed against the silence. The reflective insight is a haunting one. People shape death to articulate life. Mortuary rituals encode values, anchor kinship, and create continuity. Göbekli Tepe's relative silence on full burials might therefore be a statement, a place for the living to gather, sing, and remember, leaving the complex negotiations over the dead to nearby settlements and burial grounds. Or perhaps the stones themselves, once sealed and buried, became a kind of grave, a folded memory that incorporated both absence and presence. We still don't know the full spectrum of belief, but the interplay of bones, stone, and intention tells us that death and memory were central to how people organized social life. Then, inevitably, the myths mushroom into legends. In popular imagination, Göbekli Tepe morphs into an origin story predecessor, a center of an ancient priesthood, an astronomical observatory for a lost calendar, a refuge for giants or survivors of a pre-flood world, a library of stone containing knowledge erased by subsequent ages. These are attractive because they tell a single, sweeping narrative where complexity otherwise reigns. They are also a natural human reflex, to demand story over ambiguity. Responsible storytelling refuses to crush wonder in the name of dryness, but it also refuses to let romance flatten nuance. The pillars are human works, not alien artifacts. The motifs are cultural, not cosmic. Giants make for great headlines, but the material record supports subtle, human-scale explanations far more convincingly. Skilled artisans, cooperative communities, ritual specialists, long-distance remembering. That does not make the story less grand. If anything, it magnifies it. A small group of humans, with only flint and shared memory, organized feats of labor and intelligence that shifted the course of social life. That is its own kind of miracle. Picture again the plateau at night, stars above and the pillars like guardians frozen mid-gesture. Think of the long chain of people who touched those stones, sang to them, carved new marks, and eventually sealed them. The reflective insight is this: the urge to make meaning in public spaces, to bind communities with feats that outlast a single life, is as human as breathing. Göbekli Tepe asks us to enlarge our sense of possibility, that human beings 10,000 years ago could imagine permanence, could coordinate across space, and could invest in memory in ways that reshaped how subsequent generations would live. We still don't know every ritual, every story, every decision that made the stone rise, but the partial glimpses we have are enough to reconfigure how we tell the deep story of our species. As the tale unspools, questions proliferate, but a few threads come together with clarity. People in the pre-pottery Neolithic were more inventive and more communal than once thought. Ritual practice could, and likely did, structure economic decisions. Symbolic languages circulated across landscapes and created shared identities. And the archaeological methods that reveal these things, careful stratigraphy, radiocarbon chronology, iconographic analysis, each carries strengths and limits that scholars must balance. Each of these points is not the end of a debate but the beginning of many others. The stone circles are not answers so much as persistent, eloquent questions. They invite us to look not only at the past but at ourselves. How do we choose to remember, to bind, to build? How do communal rituals alter economies and political life, even before the first permanent walls are raised? If you place your palm on a carved pillar, you feel not only old stone but a continuity of human puzzlement. The people who carved the animal forms and abstract marks made choices about what to make permanent. They chose icons, scales, and placements. Those choices were politics without paperwork, theology without scripture, and engineering without blueprints. They were acts of imagination that expected other imaginations to come later and to continue the conversation. We still don't know the precise syntax of that conversation, but we can hear the cadence, repetition, variation, response. The pillars are a chorus whose meaning emerges when multiple voices, the archaeologists, the ethnographers, the chemists, the poets, sing together. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.